What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the College Football Podcast. And we have a lot that happened last week. Colin has decided to join us again. As we all know, last week, like I said, he was ducking the show because of Tennessee's 30-point loss, but now he's back. So we'll see exactly where Tennessee comes in on the rankings. We'll start off there, though. At 25, I have Tennessee. They did move down a good amount as well. It hasn't been a good few weeks for them, but as of right now, I still do have them ranked. I know there's some people kind of on the edge. Maybe they should be ranked, maybe they shouldn't be ranked. But out of the four loss teams, I think they're probably the best at this point. So there's a lot of teams that are very in that middle to good area. And I would say Tennessee's probably the best there.
Yeah, fair enough. And as you guys see from my graphic, Tennessee will not be appearing in my rankings this week and probably not again for the rest of the season. In 25, I have North Carolina State. They're a team, they're only a three-loss team. They're in an ACC, which is also tough. Probably not as tough as the SEC, but you get my point here. And they have wins over teams like Clemson and Miami, who I personally don't know if Tennessee would have beaten to this point. But to focus back on the Wolfpack, Brennan Armstrong, he really did it all last week. He had 300 total yards and 4 touchdowns against Virginia Tech. They're a team that's definitely flown under the radar. They are not necessarily beating on top-level talent, but teams like Clemson and Miami, who we'll mention, have given tests to some of the better teams on this list. They've handled both of those teams easily, so giving a little bit of credit to them there.
Yeah. And next up here at 24, I have UNC. This team has been on and off throughout the season, but a team that definitely has struggled. They were looking good towards the beginning of the year. And they, like I said, they've had some issues that they've run into. Drake May has looked pretty good, especially the past few weeks. They're going to go up against NC State to finish off the season. Both of these teams at 8-3 right now. North Carolina, UNC is worse in the ACC than NC State. So whoever wins this game could end up with some pretty good positioning. And UNC overall, this episode, we can talk about kind of the teams kind of like in this area where they're not going to be seeing a championship game. So North Carolina was very high towards the beginning of the season, falling down with some of those losses. A little bit disappointing when you have one of the best quarterbacks in the country and some of those games really fell out of your hands when you were in the lead for a lot of them. They've had a lot of good play from their running back Hampton as well. So kind of disappointing to see that they're here. Still ranked, could easily be towards the top 15 if they win this week with a lot of losses from other teams. But you would expect a team with Drake May should be able to compete for the ACC championship. And it just seems like they fell a little bit flat.
Yeah, and I have North Carolina off my rankings as well, but they're a team hanging right around there. Obviously disappointing, as you mentioned. On 24, I have Utah, another team that's been disappointing this year, and they've had some really tough losses. But with that being said, they're a four-loss team, the only four-loss team I have here. But all of those losses are to Pac-12 teams, which I have ranked, and they do have wins over Florida, USC, UCLA. So, I mean, obviously they've disappointed, but I do think they've shown signs of life this season. And despite obviously no Cam Rising, who we've talked about all year, didn't play this year. They'll probably still end up 8-4 this season, which is better than I expected once we heard that Rising wasn't coming back. With that being said, Bryson Barnes has shown some flashes of being a really good quarterback. Obviously, this last week against Arizona, they looked horrible. They came out flat, and there was nothing on that side of the ball that really impressed. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about the best 25 teams in the country with their given resume, I do think they deserve to be there.
Yeah, next up, Iowa, who I have here at 23. I know that there's a lot of people that are a lot higher than them, as high as 16 for the AP poll. I'm just really not that impressed with this team overall. They're good. They've won a good amount of games. They're in the Big Ten, but that offense, as we all know, has just been terrible the past few years and for a long time, really. So this team, especially compared to a lot of other teams, I'm just really not as impressed. They did have a good season here. Kind of weird to see them this low as a 9-2 team in the Big Ten, but it just seems like the competition that they've been playing, even though they're in the Big Ten, they didn't beat Penn State, and both of these teams with the same record. I don't see these teams even being close at all. We saw them compete, and Penn State blew them out of the water. So I just don't see how both of these teams are close. And even though you're 9-2 in the Big Ten overall, it just really doesn't impress me overall, but they're still good enough to get ranked.
Yeah, I would say definitely a top 25 team still. And at 23, a team that's been impressing us all year that really fell flat last week is James Madison. I mean, they go up against App State, a rival at home, obviously college game day, a lot of expectations, and they just came out in a way that you simply can't if you want to be one of the top 25 teams in the country. Because of their resume, they're still going to earn a spot here for me. We've seen them be one of the better teams in all of college football week after week, and that's just not what we got this week. I mean, they started way too slow, and they just couldn't find anything going in the run game. I mean, their running back, their lead back, Lawton, only got 37 yards in the whole game. That's not going to be enough to, win against any team, much less App State, who is one of the best teams on their schedule. So disappointing game from the Dukes. Obviously, that was a team we thought could win out. I think we both predicted them to, and they just couldn't do so. I still think they're a good team, but really for a group of 5 team that was 10-0 at this point, anything less than winning out, we're going to be pretty upset there.
Yeah, and I have them here at 22. And it seems like maybe the college football committee came in here, potentially rigged this game just to show that JMU shouldn't be in the playoffs. I know a lot of people upset that didn't end up in a playoff position this year, not being able to be ranked for the playoffs, but still overall a very impressive season. One of the top 25 teams in college football as of right now. So they definitely deserve to be ranked at this point. Though they do have a loss that came last week, I still think they should be up here.
Absolutely. And at 22 is a team that we've been comparing them to the last couple of weeks. I have Liberty here jumping up a couple spots. I mean, they, unlike JMU, are standing at 11-0 right now, and they've kind of overtaken that spot of the team having, the miraculous season. I don't want to dig too much on the Dukes here, but we saw Liberty and they play against comparable competition. And right now they're 11-0. They're a really good football team. And one of the main reasons is because Quentin Cooley has had such a good season. And what a game he had this week. I mean, he got 100 yards on only 8 rushes. I mean, if you feed this guy the ball, he's going to be one of the leading rushers in all of college football. And I think this proves that. So really efficient game. Really liked what I saw from Liberty, obviously running over a team like UMass, who, we personally saw firsthand lose by about 70 points to Penn State earlier this year. So they did what they had to do. I think Liberty's a really good football team, and any team that comes into this week undefeated is surpassing expectations, playing impressive. And I think the Flames are just one of those teams.
Yeah, and I have them here at 21. Basically, all the same things that you said. This team has looked very good. They go past James Madison after James Madison's loss this week. They've been very impressive, finally getting a championship game back to their home area, Liberty. It seems like a good program that is on the up. Maybe they'll be able to draw in some bigger recruits now, maybe get some guys out of the portal after a good season like this. And it's always good to see a team like that jumping up in the rankings.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good for college football. At 21, I have Iowa. As you mentioned, I don't think either of us are really this high on the Hawkeyes, but you have to give credit where it's due. As you mentioned, 9-2 and one of the best conferences of all of college football. Even if they breeze by some of the easy teams and don't show out against the good ones, at the end of the day, it's a good resume to have at this point. And they didn't give up anything to that Illinois offense, who we've seen at times can be pretty explosive. I mean, that just goes to show they really do have one of the best defenses in the country. And I will say, we saw Caden McNamara, specifically in that Penn State game, be the main reason why Iowa cannot compete against higher level talent. Now they're starting Deacon Hill, and he looked competent enough at quarterback. His stats don't wow me, but when you watch the plays he made, at least he's willing to create. And Iowa, in an offense that doesn't allow much creation, excitement, or any good football, it's nice to see a guy at least try. So with a really great defense and a good resume, you have to give Iowa some credit, but I'm with you in the extent where I don't think they're a top level team, and I don't think they can compete if they match up against one.
Yeah, and at 20 here, I have Kansas State. Going out the past few weeks, I haven't had them ranked. They go in, they beat a ranked Kansas team. A very close game. Will Howard gets it done, and they end up winning. So at this point, I do think they kind of deserve to be ranked now. Getting that ranked win over Kansas, both of those teams very close, and they'll start off the top 20.
Yeah, and at 20, I have Oklahoma State, a team that you're a little bit higher on. Obviously, 2 weeks ago, an embarrassing loss to Central Florida, but they handled business going into Houston, which kind of felt like a sort of trap game, definitely rivalry and some stakes on the line, and they go in and handle business. Ollie Gordon on the ground was incredible. I mean, dominated the run game, picked up 3 touchdowns, and obviously a ton of yards along the way. I like the Cowboys. I think they're good. I know they have that head-to-head win against Kansas State, but they just kind of screwed their season with a team that I look at who's a little bit better, like Louisville, who has one horrible loss to Pitt and has impressed me pretty much every other week. I think Oklahoma State really dug themselves a grave with that loss to UCF, but in the current moment, they're only rising up my rankings because they are a really good football team.
Yeah, and a team that has had some good expectations this year, they kind of fell flat too. Notre Dame here at 19 with 3 losses. They did have a very tough schedule this year, but when you have a guy like Sam Hartman, when you have one of the best rosters in college football at this point, you look at every single player, you go from tight end to quarterback to running back. They have some of the top guys at pretty much every position. And they did lose to Ohio State, tough loss there. They did bounce back against a ranked Duke. They do lose to Louisville, and then they go back and they bounce back against a ranked USC. So you think that potentially maybe this 2-loss team, if some things shake their way, they could have a good season. But obviously that loss to Clemson kind of put the nail in the coffin for this season. They were very good. They ran into a tough schedule, and they came through going 2 for 2 in ranked games, but when you lose to Clemson, you can't really end up being that high towards the end of the season. This could have been a top 10 team with 2 losses, but that loss definitely brings them down. And a disappointing season if you're a Notre Dame fan, especially with the way that it started with how good Sam Hartman looked.
Yeah, and that's kind of just the luck of the draw when you root for a team that's an independent. I mean, they decide how tough their tasks are going to be. Obviously, they go for the ACC route, but at the end of the day, they gave themselves a tough schedule. And as you mentioned, they lived up to expectations sometimes, and other times they fell flat. With that being said, they're on my 19th spot as well. Just in a weird place. If you look at this last week and look at just what we saw on the field, that was great Notre Dame football. I mean, Wake Forest is no powerhouse, but that's a revenge game for Sam Hartman, and that's a game where there's a lot of stakes. And as I've been saying, there's a lot on the line. I feel like we watched a lot of games where there was pride involved, and this was definitely one of them. And just to kind of put it in perspective, I think it's very comparable to what we saw when Dylan Gabriel had to match up against UCF, and he kind of faltered. It looked like a tough game, and we didn't see the best of him. In opposition to that, we see Sam Hartman absolutely dominate against Wake Forest. So it is nice to see. It's definitely, if you're a Notre Dame fan, it's a good way to come to a close of your season. Obviously, they got another game, but we're facing the end of a season that has been disappointing to a certain extent. So it's definitely a high note. You'll look back at the 2023 season and be happy that Hartman had such a dominating performance against Wake Forest. But at the end of the day, this is barely a top 20 team in the country. And they have their moments, but they just couldn't really figure it out every week. And if they did, I mean, with that strength of schedule, it might be the number 1 team in the country, just not playing at that level right now. And the future is not as bright as we see with some of these other top tier programs. So a lot to be said there, a lot of work to be done, but Notre Dame still got another game to play. So we'll have more to say about them going forward.
Another team kind of in a different area. Tulane here at 18. They've won their past 10 games, 9 games. They lost against Ole Miss earlier in this season. So a big question mark. I mean, if they go out and beat ranked Ole Miss at that point, we know how good Ole Miss has been now. This team could be very high in the rankings. It seems like the AP has kept them at 24 and let everyone jump around them the whole season. I've been impressed with this team. Michael Pratt, a guy that's going to put his name in the hat for the NFL, potentially one of those guys that could, if he lands in a good position, could be sneaky good on a team, maybe a very good backup. He could end up playing some games at some point. So we'll see how he fares in the NFL. But this Tulane team has been great all year, only losing that one game to Ole Miss where they could have had it. And in the end, if you're Tulane, you look at this season, as long as they can go out, win this next game, go and win the American, I think it's a very successful season. But it is going to be a tough task. Assuming that they go up against SMU at this point, I know things could shake up depending on this last week. If UTSA goes out and wins, maybe SMU loses. But as of right now, Tulane and SMU should be a great game in the American Championship. So that should be impressive to watch. Hopefully, Michael Pratt goes out there and gets another good game. I don't know if he'd end up playing in their bowl game, if they end up having one, good one. It depends on where we see him in the draft process, but I assume he would probably go out there and do it. He's not a high-end first or second round guy at this point. Maybe he had a little bit of hype going into the season, but it seems like it's died down a little bit. Closer to a day 3 guy, so I would expect him to play, and hopefully he can go out there, maybe rise his draft stock up in this past few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And at 18 is a team I mentioned a little bit earlier. I have Kansas State. I've been jumping up quite a bit as well. And when I really look at their season, and obviously they still have games left to play, but when you take a look back at the current moment, all of their games have been very, very close, win or lose. And that includes the games that they played against the ranked teams. And we just saw one last week as they come out on top at Kansas. Just a very impressive game. Again, rivalry game. You got to go out. The tensions are high, and Kansas State converted, and specifically Giddens converted. DJ Giddens looked incredible. And not to mention, I mean, we've seen this Kansas Jayhawks team be absolutely dominating on offense. They build their team around a high flying, gunslinging sort of way, and they are susceptible to put up a lot of points. They're a good offense, and Kansas State's defense stepped up when they had to. It wasn't necessarily a low scoring affair, but eventually when you get the last stop, a lot of the times that's going to win you games, and that's what Kansas State did. I've been impressed with what they've been doing. They were a team I had ranked very highly towards the start of the season, higher than most, and now they're kind of climbing their way back up to that spot. So I like what the Wildcats are doing. I think they're a competitive team, and any given Saturday, I really do think they can compete with some of the best teams in college football. So they jump up pretty far with that respect given.
Yeah, next up, I have Oklahoma State here. This is an interesting team just because they've had a lot of big wins this season, going out beating Kansas, beating Oklahoma. Like you said earlier, that loss earlier in the season to South Alabama doesn't help them. Iowa State doesn't help them. Recently, UCF doesn't help them. But it seems like as of right now in the conference, they're above Oklahoma as of right now. So there's still a lot of shakeup that could happen towards the end of this season. Oklahoma State, a very good team. They've played a lot of good football this year. Just overall, from top to bottom, this team has been very impressive. Obviously, Ollie Gordon has been great. One of the very good sophomores in college football right now. Between guys like him, Damian Martinez, Nick Singleton, and Katron Allen, there's a lot of good sophomore running backs. So I expect to see a lot of high running back play next year in what could be a very good running back class in the NFL. So hopefully we continue to see these guys advance. And Oklahoma State still definitely in the mix here. Probably not for a playoff spot. I think there would be one of the biggest long shots to be close. I don't see a 3-loss team making the playoffs, but still in the running at this point, technically for that Big 12 championship game.
Yeah. And at 17, I have a team that you were just talking about a little bit earlier with Tulane. I'm also a guy that's high on Tulane. I do think they play really good football. And yes, the competition is weak, but you just see the way that they play ball and they dominate. I know the score sheet won't always say that, but easily the best team in the American, in my opinion. SMU was pretty close, though. With that being said, against FAU last week, their defense really didn't allow the Owls to do anything, especially in that run game. There's absolutely nothing let up. And as you mentioned, I think the big storyline of Tulane's season is Michael Pratt. He has another efficient game where he shows good decision making and he's trying to get that draft buzz. When I look at a guy like him, I'm not looking at the first round necessarily. And I hate to compare him to a guy who I know you're also not a fan of, but when I see a guy like Brock Purdy finding NFL success, I kind of see some similar traits to Michael Pratt. These are guys that are given opportunities to create in college and, are athletic to a certain extent, but they really do have football brains. And I think that could work in any given system that, provides quarterback success really no matter who it is. So with Michael Pratt, I've been impressed with what I've seen this season. I think he's definitely an NFL level quarterback. Don't really know if he's a starter, but that will be seen when we go through the process a little more. For the Green Wave, if Tulane can go out and win the American, they're going to get a good bowl game. And as you mentioned, I hope to see Pratt there because I like watching Tulane play football. They're a really good team.
Next up, I have Oregon State here at 16. Taking that loss last week to Washington is obviously tough when we look at their season. They've been good, but they've definitely had some struggles. They're going to go out here and play Oregon, a tough game, and they're not going to be able to make the playoffs as of right now, not going to make that Pac-12 championship game, but they can definitely mess up Oregon. And I think in a game like this, where there's a lot of high stakes, if you go out and beat Oregon, they're a 2-loss team, and then Oregon somehow goes out and beats Washington and they win the Pac-12 championship. I don't think they're going to put a 2-loss Pac-12 champion in when there's so many other teams at this area. They could go in and put a 1-loss Big Ten team, whether it's Ohio State or Michigan, in. I think they would put them in over a 2-loss Pac-12 champion. Texas, or whoever wins the Big 12 too. So I think Oregon State could go out here and mess up Oregon's season for the rest of the year. That's going to be a very good game to watch. Damian Martinez, like I was saying earlier, great running back this season, and he's going to hopefully continue to improve, be part of that great sophomore class next year. And this team still has some room to wiggle, still has some room to get up into the top 10 towards the end of the season, and another massive game for them this week.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing that Oregon State wants to do more than beat Oregon, mess up their season. With their season kind of sunk, I mean, a very impressive one, don't get me wrong, but with their playoff hopes sunk, they definitely want to go out and make the Ducks have no shot. And that would absolutely do so with how much competition we see at the top end of this list. And with that being said, reflecting on last week, we've seen my guy Damian Martinez show out really week to week, one of the best running backs in college football, as we mentioned a couple times. And I think you and I, Banning, are both pretty happy with DJ Ungole playing absolutely terrible, probably being the reason that they lost that game against Washington. So making you sound pretty smart, and Damian Martinez still having himself a game, making me sound pretty smart. So Oregon State, a team we've talked about quite a bit. I do think they go out and compete against Oregon. I think we both know the Ducks are the better team, but we've seen Oregon State play with the best of them. That Washington game, they really shot themselves in the foot. They could have won, and that would have easily been their biggest game of the year. So they're definitely an up and down team. They can be hot and they can be cold, but I think they're going to come out with some fire against Oregon. I do not expect that to be a blowout on either end. I think it's going to be a really good game we get next week.
Yeah. And talking about another team in this same division, we have Arizona here. This team has been very impressive, as we've talked about the past few weeks, going out and beating some very good teams. I mean, the stretch that they've been on, going against Washington and then USC, Washington State, who we had ranked pretty high earlier in this season, going out, they beat Oregon State. That's why I have them ranked above Oregon State at this point. Both of them very close coming into this week, and I just had to give them the nod. They played pretty recently and they beat them. Then going up against Colorado, another tough game. Utah, another tough game. So they've been very impressive. They're going to go up against Arizona State to end the season. Should end up on a high note. This team has been very impressive. And like I've said, with those 3 losses this season, maybe if you erase 1 or 2 of those, they could be one of the best teams in the country. So a lot of momentum for this Arizona team going into the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got to give credit to Arizona, because when you look at the schedule preseason, this is the team that I anticipated to rack up, 5 or 6 losses. That is a really tough schedule, one of the toughest in the country, in my opinion. And just reflecting on last week, you absolutely smashed Utah, a team that, was supposed to be better, obviously ranked quite a bit higher in preseason. And then I think we kind of all expected Arizona to win that game just because of how hot they've been and what we've seen on the field. And just a little shout out. I mean, Noah Fifita has week to week played really high level football and kind of flown under the radar. I mean, he's had good game after good game, and that leads the Wildcats far. I know that seems simple, but when you really think about it, I mean, it's really hard to lose games in the Pac-12 when you're putting up 40, and he's been the catalyst behind that, obviously at helm at the quarterback position. So this Wildcats team, I say it week after week, really surpassing my expectations. This is genuinely one of the better Arizona teams we've seen in a long time, and racking up a win against Utah solidifies that for me as, them being one of the best 3-loss teams in the country. And I can see a pretty good argument for the best.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you maybe a better argument for this team, another 3-loss team, which I have above them. LSU has been fantastic this year. Going into this season, I remember the beginning when we started this podcast at the beginning of the year, LSU was one of my favorites to make the playoffs, and they've had a very tough schedule, but they've continued to stick around that top 15 area. That loss to Florida State earlier in the season, it didn't look great, but as we know now, Florida State, one of the best teams in the country. That loss to Ole Miss, a top 10-ish team in the country, depending on where you want to look. Alabama, a team that is vying for a playoff spot. So 2 of their 3 losses could be teams potentially in the playoffs this year. And then Ole Miss, another team that could end up in the top 10. So it is a little tough when you look at those games. And if they went out and won those games, I mean, this is a team that would be very tough to beat. And Jayden Daniels has been fantastic throughout this year. As we all know, with guys like Malik Neighbors out there, it has been hard to stop this team. Jayden Daniels just passed the 1,000-yard mark on the season with 10 touchdowns, 3,500 passing yards on the season. He's been fantastic. Brian Thomas, another great receiver for them, 2,000-yard receivers. This team has exceeded some expectations for some people. I know a lot of people maybe weren't as high on them going into the year. There was a lot of people who thought they could make the playoffs, maybe win the SEC. So there's a middle ground on where you think this LSU team is right now. I think that they've played good. Obviously, those losses are tough to bite, but in the end, I guess you can look back and say, if we lost the games in the season, it's good that we only lost against the really good teams. Maybe no tough losses on the schedule this year, but they do have to figure some things out. Jayden Daniels entering the draft, Malik Neighbors entering the draft, but they should be able to retool and come back next year. And it looks good. They have a lot of good, young, promising players on this team. Should be able to continue to build in the SEC. That has been the most wide open that we've seen in a while. Outside of maybe Georgia, the SEC West has been very competitive.
Absolutely. And I'm going to make that same argument. I think LSU is the best 3-loss team in college football. And it's very simple. Their 3 losses are all 3 very competitive losses, and they've absolutely dominated every other game. They're a really good team. When you're led by Jayden Daniels, arguably the best quarterback in all of college football right now, it's going to be hard not to put points up on the board. As you mentioned, Malik Neighbors, an absolute X factor, one of the best receivers in college football as well. So we know the offense is great. We've seen their defense let up in certain games, but we've also seen against some of these competition that is maybe a little bit lighter, not a team like Alabama, for example, their defense has stepped up and looked great. So, you got to beat the best to be the best. I understand that, but they've done everything else to an exceptional level this year. So I'm pretty high on LSU as well. With that being said, this A&M game, I don't know why it feels like a trap game. I really don't want them to gloss over that because it would definitely boost their morale to end the season on a high note. But with Fisher out of A&M, with A&M being, definitely riding the high of that, they look a lot more confident out there, and A&M being at home, I'm scared that LSU could lose this game, but I still think they're going to win. I still think this is the better team on paper, but it's definitely a game I'm going to be tuned into because I'm a little bit worried. I'm very interested to see what the spread looks like on that. I haven't checked it out, so definitely something to think about.
Yeah, and another team that has a lot that has to happen for them, Oklahoma here at 13. That loss to Oklahoma State and Kansas, those back-to-back losses, definitely messed up their potential Big 12 championship games. And it's going to be tough because they need to win. They need Texas to win, and they need Oklahoma State to lose. So they need a little bit of help since they have that head-to-head loss against Oklahoma State. They're going to need some help there, but this Oklahoma team has been great. Going into the season, my main question, could Dillon Gabriel be great? And the question got answered in some weeks. Some weeks there was tough games like we saw against Kansas and Oklahoma State when they lost. Going out, they beat Texas earlier in the season, a very big win. That's why they're still staying afloat here. They could potentially be in that Big 12 championship, but like I said, they're going to need some help. And if they get that, then they could get their rematch, potentially get some revenge against Texas. But as of right now, it's going to be tough for them to make it in.
Yeah, and I lost a little bit of lighting here, excuse me, but I have Oklahoma in the 13th spot, and for all the reasons you mentioned, their season isn't necessarily going the way that we may have expected it to when we both had them ranked in that 5th spot just a couple weeks ago. Obviously, some things didn't fall their way, and in this BYU game, I was scared it was going to be the same thing. I mean, they avoided an upset. BYU actually had some momentum, especially coming out of halftime, and the Sooners did show quite a bit of grit ending up on top of that game. I don't think they compete with some of the best teams in the country here. Obviously, we both have them at the 13 spot, not necessarily that top tier level, but they've shown flashes of being incredible. If everything fell their way and they somehow were competing for a playoff spot, I don't necessarily think they're one of those teams that would sneak in and get blown out or anything. I do think they're competitive, but just seeing them underperform in too many games for me to be as high on them. Still think it's a great team. So credit where it's due. Dillon Gabriel, although disappointing in some weeks, I still do think he's one of the better QBs in the whole game. So credit there as well. Oklahoma, definitely 50-50 on them sometimes, but they are one of the most competitive teams in college football right now.
Yeah, another team that you could say the same thing about, Penn State here at 12. They lost 2 of their big games this season against Michigan and Ohio State. So obviously that kind of leaves them out of the playoff contention, not going into the Big Ten championship, which some people had some high expectations for them this year. And they're not going to be able to make that game, obviously losing against Michigan and Ohio State, but there's still some good wins outside of that. There's a lot of question marks going into next season. What's going to happen with this team with guys like Drew Allar, who got hurt? Beau Pribula went in last game and he played very well for them offensively. And there is a lot of questions. The defense is losing some big players, but they should be able to retool, and they're not going to have to play Ohio State and Michigan next year. They are going to have to go up against some tougher teams too, like USC and Washington. Both of those teams losing their quarterback, though. So whenever we talk about these Big Ten teams, it is going to be a very different look next year because the schedules are going to get tough for pretty much everyone. There's not going to be walking around and not having any tough games until the end of the season, like teams like Michigan have had this year. So everything's going to change next year. And for the better, it should be a lot more competitive within the Big Ten. It seems like every year it's really between Michigan and Ohio State. And then maybe once in a decade, Penn State goes out there, gets some players like Saquon Barkley and compete for a Big Ten championship. But it should be a lot more competitive. Penn State hopefully can go out there and thrive in this new Big Ten system.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And the SEC, they're staying a little bit untouched, but I'm going to kick it there with Ole Miss. I mean, I wouldn't say untouched. I mean, Texas and Oklahoma is going to be pretty big, but in the current moment, Ole Miss, I have them at 12. And Jackson Dart in this ULM game showed that what we've seen from him this season is, in my opinion, a little bit disappointing. I do think he has that top end talent. I mean, we look at one of our first mock drafts we did earlier in the season, and you mocked Jackson Dart to go in that 19th spot, mid first round, and I really do think he's that talented. So we've seen some disappointing marks from this season, but that was not what we saw against ULM. I mean, he absolutely was incredible out there. And I think given a better situation, maybe Quinshon Judkins being a little bit more impressive towards the start of the season and not picking it up so late, this Ole Miss team is legitimately a playoff level team. And that's why I sound a little bit disappointed here, because I wish we saw that version of the Rebels. I do think they're that good. I think they're competing with teams like Alabama, who they obviously didn't play their best against. But in the current moment, I have them in the top 12. I do think they're one of the best teams in the SEC and in all college football. They go up against Mississippi State. It's going to be on the road. Of course, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, long-term rivals, but I do think they come out on top of that. And when it comes to the college football rankings, I know they've been a little bit lower on Ole Miss, but there's legitimate contention for them to be a top 10 team in the country when it's all said and done. And when you look at a team like Ole Miss, who we've seen very high highs and very low lows from in the last couple of years, I don't think their fans can reflect on this season and be too upset about it. But I really do think they could have scratched the top and been one of the best teams in college football. So maybe from an outsider's perspective, I do feel a little bit disappointed from this Rebel season.
Yeah. And I mean, adding on, as I've said this whole episode, adding on to that list of sophomore running backs that are great, Quinshon Judkins, this team with him and Jackson Dart, if Jackson Dart decides to stay, which I do think it would definitely benefit him now, it just seems like there's no way he could really make his way into that first round. It would be very tough to make his way into the second round now, just because there's so much talent on the board. I think it would definitely be good for him to stay. Him and Quinshon Judkins next year as a junior and a senior would be great for this Ole Miss team. Continue to build. They've had a very good season. I know that, like you said, they've been in some tough scenarios too, where if they went out and beat Alabama earlier in the season, which it was close, they could be competing for an SEC championship, but that didn't happen in the end. They went out, they lost to Georgia, and maybe that showed us that even if they beat Alabama, they wouldn't really have competed in the SEC championship. I know there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but it's still a good season for Ole Miss overall. Hopefully we get to see another year of Jackson Dart. I'm a big fan of him, and I think with another year of him in that system, should be able to thrive and be able to compete again.
Absolutely. And at 11, I have Penn State. You just talked about them there. It's tough to see Lar go down, and it was fun for me to see Beau Pribula play. Obviously, a very fun player, but hopefully Lar is healthy and good. And, as we project to next season, he's going to be the option there. So you want to see him perform. With that being said, when you reflect on the Nittany Lions season, you lose to Ohio State, you lose to Michigan. Those are tough games. Obviously, we've seen in the last couple of years, those are two of the perennial contenders in college football. So it's always a tall task when you got to go up against them. Very excited to see what they do next year, not taking them on and going against USC and Washington. Those are going to be very exciting games in the new Big Ten. And this Penn State has shown flashes. They've started out slow in a lot of games. I think that's really what killed them specifically against Ohio State. So, I mean, they're not necessarily the perfect college football team, but when you reflect on the season, I think there's a lot to build on at Penn State. They're going to be returning a ton of talent. I think they're another team that can make a big run next year, and we'll have to wait and see on that. But in the current moment, Penn State just hanging outside of my top 10 here, and we expect them to do big things going forward.
Yeah, and Mizzou here, probably the biggest surprise of the season here at 10, and they've had a fantastic season. Last week, a very good game against Florida, back and forth. surprisingly, they somehow came out on top. They were in an instance where fourth and very long, and they somehow converted. Luther Burden took over at the end of the game, one of the best receivers in the country as a sophomore. He's going to be a great NFL talent. And this team, like I said, one of the best surprises of the year. They've been very good all year. They've had some tough losses against Georgia, but every team's lost to Georgia the past few years, and they lost to LSU, a tough game there, but some big wins against Kansas State, against Kentucky, against Tennessee. So they've definitely had a very good season. Brady Cook has played very good for them overall, and probably the biggest surprise of the season, ending up in the top 10 as of right now. If they win this week, which I think they do, they could probably end up in that top 10, maybe get a New Year's Six Bowl at this rate.
Yeah, Missouri, easily the most impressive team in the SEC. Pretty close. I think we're going to talk about another team in a little bit that could also be considered very surprising, but just what a year we've seen from Missouri so far. I mean, they made the most of a somewhat easy SEC schedule when it comes to some of the teams they played down the stretch. I know they've had to play the best of the best as well. So when you watch that game against Georgia, they got absolutely flattened. But outside of that, I mean, they come out on top of Tennessee and Florida, which are two of their tougher games. As you mentioned, Brady Cook, he looked great last week. He's been looking pretty good all season. And just what an absolute team effort. I mean, the defense has stepped up, the offense, the special teams. We've seen the receivers, as you mentioned, they have one of the best in the country, even the running game, which I didn't expect to project as being very competitive. Their running game looks great. I mean, really just all across the board, a really good team. And it's not what I expected from the Tigers going into the year. So you build off this. Obviously, SEC teams don't have as much trouble recruiting as some of the other conferences we talk about. Guys want to play in the SEC. And, you know, if I'm a junior or senior in high school and I look at a Missouri team competing like this, that builds a whole lot of momentum. So excited to see what they do going forward. Obviously, this is one of the best years they've had in a little while. So hopefully they build on this, because when Missouri is good, it makes the SEC a lot more competitive, makes it very fun. And I'm happy that we got to see that in 2023.
Yeah, and like you alluded to, another team with a surprising year. Louisville here at 9. They just cemented themselves a game in the ACC championship with one loss right now. If they go out and beat Florida State, I think there's definitely an argument that they could make their way into the playoffs. There's still a lot that we could see. So that should be a very good game. This week, they do have to go out there and win, even though they could potentially lose this game and they'll still be fine. They'll still be in the ACC championship. Their playoff hope wise, they need to win this game to still stay alive with one loss. It should be a very good game. They're going to play Kentucky. Kentucky's been very competitive all season. We had them ranked earlier in the season, but they've had a very tough schedule this year with some tough losses against Alabama. They just had a tough loss against South Carolina, having to play against Missouri, Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida in a 4-week stretch. I mean, those are 4 of the best teams in the country. Florida did fall off a little bit, but at that point, Florida was ranked. That was probably when they were the best. They went out and they beat Florida. But after that, losing against Georgia, Missouri, and Tennessee kind of gave them the end of their season. But it still should be a very close game between Louisville and Kentucky. We'll talk about them a little bit more once we get closer to that ACC championship. But this team has been fantastic.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to see Louisville, because there's really not a whole lot of must-win games left on the schedule until we get to championship time. So I'm really just looking forward to this next week. And Louisville is definitely in one, because as you mentioned, there is going to be some arguments if they go out and beat Kentucky, they go out and beat Florida State. I mean, there's definitely a standpoint of them being a playoff team, which is not what I expected this year. But if they lose to Kentucky, the ACC championship is nice. I understand that schools take a lot of pride in winning their conference championship, but it's not going to lead to playoff success, right? You're not going to get there if you lose to Kentucky, and Kentucky is very, very competitive. So I have them in the 9 spot for similar reasons. We'll talk about Florida State in a little bit, but in that game, they're not going to be going against a 100% Florida State team. So they may be favored. They might be going into that game as somewhat heavy favorites. We'll have to wait and see what it looks like on that. But the Cardinals, what a year. I think if they win these last 2 games, it's going to be very, very exciting and very close to see what happens to end it. So they just got to handle business. Easier said than done against 2 very competitive teams, but I think Louisville can really do it.
Yeah, and with these final 2 teams in this 7 and 8 spot, I have Texas and Alabama here. Both of these teams have had very good seasons. They've had some ups and some downs, both teams with 1 loss on the year. So not perfect. obviously Alabama losing to Texas and Texas losing to Oklahoma earlier in the year. So there's been some good games, there's been some bad games, but at this point, I have Texas above Alabama. They beat them head to head. I know that there's definitely some arguments. We've talked about it pretty much every week, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens if both of these teams with one loss and potentially maybe only one spot left in the playoffs, who would the college football committee put in, since that they usually say that head-to-head matchup is the most important thing, but when we look at the rankings, sometimes they don't even rank it like that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens between these two teams, and I don't think that will happen just because Alabama won't beat Georgia in the SEC championship, but in the end, they've had a good season. And Texas, a very good season too. They're still definitely competing for that championship, trying to make their way into the playoffs.
Yeah, and I have Alabama at 7, Texas at 8. Very somewhat similar seasons we've actually seen from these two. Obviously, Texas was to Oklahoma, Alabama was to Texas, but they both have QB struggles. Don't get me wrong, Quinn Ewers is amazing. I'm a very big fan of his, but out with the injury, that definitely hurts a little bit. And Alabama is just from quality of play. So we've seen similar struggles on the offensive side. I think their teams are very comparable. I know Texas had the head-to-head win. I do think Alabama has a little bit better of a resume. Outside of that, I do think they're a little bit better of a team. But as you mentioned, if they can both go out and win their conferences, which I don't expect to happen either, then it's going to be a very interesting conversation. And I think in the committee's eyes, they would probably lean to Texas. For me, I do think Alabama is better at the current moment. We'll have to cross that bridge if we have to come to it. But at 7 and 8, they're hanging right outside. I know I dropped Alabama down a spot. We'll talk about the team I moved up in just a little bit. So very competitive. I think the 6 through 8 is honestly maybe the most competitive part of the board. So a lot to be said there. These last 2 weeks are obviously going to be deal breakers if any of these teams catch a loss. So have to wait and see on that, but all very, very close. This is the time of the year when we expect teams to separate themselves from the pack, and these guys are very close. So definitely interesting.
Yeah, and starting off, talk about the first two teams out here, Oregon and Florida State. I know I said before, I still think that Florida State could fall off. Now it seems like it could be evident when they play against Louisville without their quarterback, Jordan Travis, who's been great all year. Hopefully he recovers and he has a good chance to be a very good NFL player. And hopefully he goes out there and he recovers and gets a good chance in the NFL. It'll be interesting to see what happens with his draft stock, just because I don't know exactly what the injury is, how long he'll be out, but hopefully he comes back from that. Oregon has been fantastic too with Bo Nix. This team has just been great overall from top to bottom. Some great receivers over there, and they're going to have a tough matchup against Oregon State this week. Like we said before, even if they go out and they lose to Oregon State, they'll still be in the Pac-12 championship. They could still win the Pac-12, but a 2-loss Pac-12 champion, I just don't see making the playoffs, just because there's going to be a lot of other teams that are within that area that are pretty good. So it'll be interesting to look at that. But they do have to win this game. They're projected to win. The line's about 14 right now for Oregon, and make what you want with that. I still think that they're a good amount better than Oregon State, but I think it will be close. It just depends on how much they really feed Damian Martinez and how the rest of that team plays. Florida State, though, they're going to have a tough matchup in the ACC championship against Louisville. And this week, I mean, it's going to be a tough matchup against Florida, too. Florida has been competitive all year, and we're really going to see how this team performs without Jordan Travis. So definitely something to look out for, even if they end up winning the game. If it's a close game, and we'll have to see what happens with that, depending on what happens with the Louisville game, too. Like you said, Louisville could go into that game potentially being favorites, maybe even heavy favorites, depending on how we see Florida State play.
Yeah, absolutely. And these teams are on a very, very similar path, as I think you've been alluding to. I have Oregon 6 and Florida State 5. I mean, they just got to win. And if they win out, they're in. I don't think there's any way of denying either of these teams, considering I know Washington beat Oregon earlier, but Oregon has looked a little bit stronger the last couple of weeks, if we can be honest, and that would even up the series. They'd be the Pac-12 champions. I don't think it's a hot take to say if Oregon beats Washington, they're definitely fighting for that 4th spot. And same with Florida State if they win out. And if they got to play Florida, I mean, they have to play Florida this week, it's going to be a tough game. I know that when we saw Jordan Travis go out, we still saw the Florida State offense move at a high level. That's great, but they were playing against an FCS school that really is not competitive in any way. So I really want to see it against, an SEC team that's shown to be competitive and is notorious for being pretty chippy against Florida State. I think that is going to be a really, really good game. Both of these teams, they just have the same thought in their minds. They have to go out and win. It's going to be very tough. They're in tough positions as well. Oregon, obviously, in a bad spot because of that loss earlier. If they were undefeated at this point, they would be a lock for one of those top 4 spots. I'm pretty confident in that. And for Florida State, I mean, they've looked great all year, but we've seen them not perform as well when Jordan Travis has dealt with injury. Obviously, this one's going to be for the season, and we've seen other factors of their game be affected by the injury bug with guys like Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson both missing time. We're in the crucial stretch of the season. These guys got to win. And with tough matchups left on the board, I'd be biting my nails a little bit if I was a fan of either of these squads. But at the end of the day, they're both playoff contenders. And I really think this top 6 is very strong. And these would definitely be my 6 favorites to make a playoff spot, which sounds obvious. But when you look at a college football poll or an AP poll, I don't know if they necessarily say the same.
Yeah, and starting off at the 4 spot, Washington, I have here. This team has been good all year. I know a lot of people have thought that maybe Bo Nix or in other instances, Jaden Daniels has jumped Michael Penix. I still think, in my opinion, Michael Penix is the Heisman. I know that his stats haven't reflected the same as guys like maybe Bo Nix have in the past few weeks, but the thing is, he's gone out there, he beat Bo Nix, and I think that definitely is something that should be looked at. And especially if they go out and they play Oregon again in the championship, if they win that game again, he's 2-0 against Bo Nix. Maybe he doesn't have the counting stats against him, but there's also the instance where the counting stats, the best player in college football, which they give to the Heisman, this is a guy that maybe they don't go out there and they blow teams out every single week, but they end up winning every single game. And sometimes it's tough, but they still have a winner on the opposite end with Michael Penix. And hopefully we get to see a rematch against them in Oregon. It should be a great game. We'll be able to preview that next week. As long as Oregon and Washington both win out this week, we'll be able to see that game. But I still think this Washington team is definitely in the mix for that playoff.
Yeah, and I'm giving them respect as well. I had Florida State higher, but when you look at a guy like Jordan Travis going down with injury and you look at how dominant we've seen Michael Penix be this season, I know it doesn't all rely on your quarterback, but I'm a little more confident in the Huskies at this point. So they're jumping into my 4 spot where I've had them before in and out. But with all that being said, I'm kind of with you on the Heisman debate here. The Heisman is a very unique trophy. It doesn't really have a set of standards like we see with awards such as the NFL MVP or the NBA MVP, where you can kind of guess who's going to get it just based on the stats. The Heisman is really unique because teams play different level of competition. They get head-to-head matchups that matter a lot more than either of the awards I just mentioned. And Michael Penix has performed in all of those situations. And I'm a big eye test guy. He passes the eye test. He just looks like the best quarterback in college football. I know it's a hot take, but he's just done everything you want him to do. They're an undefeated team. They're going to go into a Pac-12 championship, assuming it's against Oregon and assuming they are undefeated going into that matchup. And I think they will be the underdogs, and I personally think they are the better team. When it comes to an electrifying offense, I know Bo Nix has shown out, but Michael Penix, I trust to lead the charge. If I have a minute left on a drive, I want him to make that big play. And that really just showcases what we've seen from Washington this whole season. They step up when it matters. Their defense has improved so much from week 1 to where it is now, where I trust them to make a stop if they have to, even against a team like Oregon if that comes up. I think Washington is very good. I don't think I'm going out on a limb when I say that. And, if they held Oregon State to only 10 points each half. So again, I really like what the defense is doing. They are a top 4 team, and I'm really just excited for that Oregon matchup. I hope we get it with both teams going in being, playoff locks if they get it. It's going to be one of the best games in college football game, that rematch. And I wouldn't be surprised if Washington goes in and comes out on top of that. A little bit of projecting, but again, Huskies are one of the best teams in football right now.
Yeah, and we can talk about probably the best game in college football, the one that we've been waiting for all year, Ohio State and Michigan. This should be one of the best games of the season, if not the best. And there's a lot to make of this game. There's a lot to unpack. And if we look historically the past few years, it's been a lot that there has been made that Ryan Day hasn't been able to go out and beat Michigan, even though these teams have been good. And I know Michigan is the favorite going into the week starting right now. They don't have their head coach. There's a lot going on. I still am going to go with Ohio State in this game. I've had them throughout the whole season. I just think they're a better team than Michigan. I don't really believe in JJ McCarthy. And I know Ohio State may not be the best team overall, but they're going to have the best player on the field on either side of the ball, on either team. Marvin Harrison, if he can get open and they feed him, which he can get open, he is arguably the best wide receiver prospect of all time. He is fantastic. He's going to be one of the best receivers in NFL history. I mean, he's got some big shoes to fill, but if there's any guy that I've seen in the draft process, this is going to be one of those guys that could easily fill those shoes of his dad, maybe even surpass him. I know that's a lot, but this is one of the best wide receiver prospects that I've ever watched. And Ohio State should go out and win this game, in my opinion. I just think they're the better team offensively, defensively too. It should be a close game, but with everything going on too, I don't really buy too much into that just because Michigan is still going to be able to go out there and win. At the end of the day, Jim Harbaugh doesn't really call the plays offensively, doesn't really do much defensively. So I know he's still the head coach. He does make the end decisions, but it really isn't impacted that much. I know a lot of people may disagree with that. It's him being on the sideline and everything, but it's not like they have Jesus standing on the sideline. It's just Jim Harbaugh. And I know after that Penn State loss, they were crying about it after. It was a big emotional day that their head coach couldn't be there because they got caught cheating. So I guess that's emotional. They acted like he was dying or something. Doesn't matter in the end. They're going to lose this game to Ohio State. You can say whatever you want about the score, but they're just not as good. JJ McCarthy isn't as good of a quarterback, and I don't think they're going to win this game.
Yeah, you're going to hate what I'm going to do here. You guys know I like to talk. I've been yapping the whole episode. It's my favorite thing to do, but I'm going to keep it very simple here. You know what you've seen from each of these teams. You watch them. They're two of the best teams in the country. It's Colin's pick of the week, and it's Ohio State. So Michigan fans rejoice. That's usually a bad sign for the team I pick, but we've been saying it all year. I think the Buckeyes are a better team than the Wolverines. I think there are certain aspects of the ball where Michigan is better. That's no shock. They're one of the best teams in the country. But when it comes to playing competition and beating the best competition, we've seen Ohio State do it time and time again this year. We've seen Michigan do it once against Penn State, and they looked bad while doing it. I think Ohio State is the better football team. Again, score's probably going to be close. It always is in a rivalry game like this. But Colin's pick of the week is Ohio State, and I project them to win this game.
Yeah, and last we have Georgia at 1. Not too much to say here. This team, I know a lot of people maybe had them at 2. We'll see exactly what happens when Georgia goes up against Georgia Tech this week. I think you could easily make an argument whoever wins that Ohio State versus Michigan game could be the number 1 team. I don't think it really matters too much in the end. Between whoever wins the Big Ten and Georgia. I think we could probably see, if you want to predict it now, we could see Georgia versus the Big Ten champion in the college football playoff game, unless something happens. But I think Georgia is going to end up with this 1 spot as of now. We'll see what happens. I think if Ohio State wins against Michigan, they'll go back into number 1. I don't think it really matters too much to the end. In the end, all these teams, once you get in the playoffs, you have to win 2 games to become a champion. Georgia has been in these spots the past few years. Carson Beck has continued to improve the past few weeks, and I think they're going to go out there. It's a 24-point spread. Kirby Smart said that the Georgia Tech rivalry matters to him the most, so I would probably take Georgia minus 40 in this game.
Yeah, and you mentioned exactly what I wanted to say. I mean, it doesn't really matter who's going to be ranked number 1 after this week. I'm ranking these teams by how good I think they are at college football. I think Georgia's the best college football team. I think they've proven it over a 3-year span. They've proven it over a while. I mean, they go out and compete, and obviously, I'll mention it. I applaud you for not doing it, Banning. You're a good co-host, but they absolutely ran through the Tennessee Volunteers. It wasn't even a game. Tennessee started the game with a 75-yard, absolutely ginormous run from Jalen Wright. And after that, it was like JV football. I mean, Georgia absolutely owns them. They are one of the best teams in the country. They are the best team in the country, if you ask me. And, you know, seeing them dominate my favorite team definitely made me a little bit more confident in saying so. So whatever the AP says, whatever the college football poll, you know, the one that matters, whatever they say after this week where Ohio State plays Michigan, I think they're probably going to give whatever the winner of that game is the number 1 spot. And fair to a certain extent, I think no matter what we see from that game, Georgia is still going to be the best team in college football. I'm going to keep them at number 1. And assuming that minus 40 spread hits against Georgia Tech, I'm going to feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, and it will look a little bit different as we go throughout these next few weeks, just because there's going to be a lot of teams that probably won't be playing in championship games, but every single week from now on, we'll be on here. And like I said, it may be different, but we will talk about all the games going on. We still have a lot to happen. We haven't even really started the real point of the college football experience. I mean, we got through kind of this regular season, but once we get to the playoffs, once we get to the bowl games, everything changes, especially the playoffs this year. This is one of the most competitive fields that we've seen in a very long time. We're in the final week, and we have, I mean, you said it before, we have 6 teams that could be the favorite, but outside of that, we can't count out Texas, Alabama, Louisville. We have 9 teams that could all easily make their way into the playoffs. They have an easy route in there. They have to win out. But as we know, not all 9 teams can do that. We will get a little bit more clarity, at least in the Big Ten after this week, between Ohio State and Michigan. And we'll see what happens with these championship games. But we'll be on here next week to talk about what happens in the Ohio State-Michigan game and everything else that happens. And we'll be able to preview some of those championship games. So we'll see you guys then.
See you guys in the next one.